now we win. And there's John. It's not an enviable task to Eric Lowther, yeah, Art Hanger, yeah, that's right. You're all going to sit down and listen. Thank you very much. So, Bev, 6:30, we're going to have a meet and greet here. And John, it's your turn. Go ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you, everybody. You will be allowed to leave once I'm done talking. The ordeal is almost finished. No, they just leave. I very much appreciate the lively discussion that we've had here. And, you know, it's always strange organizing these conferences. Thank you. I can't do that. I'm bitter. But I do have a microphone, so I'm going to say, sit down, shut up. How nice to see you all. It's strange to spend so long organizing the conference, and this one we had a number of sort of false starts, so it's been quite a while, and then you actually get here and suddenly it's over. Except for the fact that it doesn't end when it ends. We are here to have a good time, to meet people, to hear interesting talks, and mine as well. But the idea is that when we leave, we go our separate ways, but we have learned things, we've made connections, both personal and logical, and we're better equipped to fix the problems that led us all to come here in the first place. And so I have a brief plan and then a little bit of an elucidation of it. It's a three-stepper. What are we going to do? Who are we waiting for? And what are we waiting for? And it's an interesting challenge, especially when, as I said in my first talk, you know, sort of we are somehow convened here, as Elron said. Well, you've been called here, though I did not call you. And now it's up to us to fix this problem, not because we're necessarily the people that you would have chosen had you been given a blank slate, but because we are the people who came here and listened to the talks and are now going to go and make something important happen. It really is going to be us who do it. And remember, what Matea said something which I think is quite important, that she's in a war that she knows is already won. And, you know, a great many of us have that same feeling, remembering, of course, that his kingdom is not of this world. And so the victory that we are promised does not guarantee that we're going to win the policy battle, or even, in fact, walk off the battlefield when the thing is done. And I was reading Gilbert magazine on my way here on the airplane, because it's the sort of thing that I do. And one of the articles mentioned this priest who had the encouraging habit of telling people, cheer up, you'll soon be dead. And I mean, that's the good news. You're probably thinking, don't tell us the bad news. But there is this encouraging aspect to it, not only in that there is a better world waiting for us, but also that we have been given a chance that others have not been given, and we should get too busy with it while we still have it. I have had the opportunity of visiting these war cemeteries in Europe and seeing all those tombstones of these kids who were, 18, 19, 20, and thinking to myself, when I complain about some of the things that happen as the years go by, they would have traded places with me without any hesitation. And so I'm going to wrap up in ways that will be in some sense familiar to those of you who suffered through my previous incarnations in this session, but also I hope will have a certain element of originality to justify my taking up your time, including adding on to what Matea said. This is from John Paul II. There is no evil to be faced that Christ does not face with us. There is no enemy that Christ has not already conquered. There is no cross to bear that Christ has not already borne for us. On the far side of every cross, we find the newness of life in the Holy Spirit. This is our faith. This is our witness before the world. And I do think it's important that this should be our witness before the world, that we should go into action in such a way as to make this truth manifest, not as though we have just bitten into a lemon. And I also want, because I can't resist quoting Chesterton, you're going to get a lot of him because I was reading Gilbert, and one of the problems with reading Gilbert is somehow every issue contains about 20 new Chesterton quotations I wasn't familiar with that are so important that I have to inflict them on people, and I have the PowerPoint clicker, so I can. He says, we have not any need to rebel against antiquity. We have to rebel against novelty. And that, I think, is in some sense what we're going to do. But also, when you get to specifics, one of the things that I think coming out of a conference like this is we do have a pretty good idea, at least of some of the things that we need to do. And I'm going to run through a list shortly, and it has I left Defend Ukraine off the list because apparently that's controversial in this room, and I'm looking at things we all agree on because I think it's important that there are a bunch of things that we all realize need to be done, and it's important to think about that. And again, before we do that, to quote somebody else, I have a line from Ronald Reagan. My theory of the Cold War is that we win and they lose. As you know, Ronald Reagan was a simplistic man. He held silly ideas like this all the time, and as a result of his stupidity, we did win the Cold War, and they lost it. He said that to this Richard Allen in 1977, just when Carter was being inaugurated. They had a talk, and at the end, Reagan blurted this at him, and Allen turned around and said, "Well, Governor, I don't know if you ever intend to run again for President of the United States, but if you do, please count me in." So my theory of this whole thing is that we win and they lose. And then my actual list, again, of the stuff that we shouldn't be dithering on. And it's not the whole list, but I just think these 7 are very important and illustrative. School vouchers. Privatizing universities. Why on earth is the government subsidizing the toxic sludge that has been poured into the minds of young people? If you get a university education, you wind up better off in life, as a rule, economically, socially, in every way. Why should the person who doesn't go to university pay so that you can talk loudly at parties about the stuff you think you know? Repeal the Canada Health Act. Can anybody think of a more obvious piece of failed socialism in the Western world, brought in the dying days of the first Trudeau administration by people who knew nothing about economics, and somehow it became holy writ in this country? On what possible basis? I don't know, but I'll tell you what it wasn't. Good results. Abandon net zero. Flatten and cut taxes. How could that be controversial? Balance the budget and double defense spending. We won't argue about whether we then use it in Eastern Europe. We'll just say national security is critically important. And to take school vouchers as just one example, to me this is an astonishing situation because everybody knows the school system stinks. And there's an obvious way to fix it. And the only reason it seems to me that it doesn't happen is because of this "you can't say that." You know, as Paul, nobody does that. Well, good, nobody has arrived. And by the way, Stockwell Day, who had, I think he praised me, he mentioned my habit of having a lot of quotations. And then he quoted John Stuart Mill. So in his honor, I'm going to quote John Stuart Mill. By the way, I grew up proofreading John Stuart Mill, which explains many things about me that you might not want to inflict on your own descendants. But since that's too small to read, I'll read it to you. If the government would make up its mind to require for every child a good education, it might save itself the trouble of providing one. It might leave to parents to obtain the education where and how they pleased and content itself with helping to pay the school fees of the poorer classes of children and defraying the entire school expenses of those who have no one to pay for them. The objections which are urged with reason against state education do not apply to the enforcement of education by the state, but to the state's taking upon itself to direct that education, which is a totally different thing. That the whole or any large part of the education of the people should be in state hands, I go as far as anyone in deprecating. All that has been said of the importance of individuality of character and diversity in opinions and modes of conduct involves, as of the same unspeakable importance, diversity of education. A general state education is a mere contrivance for molding people to be exactly like one another. And as the mold in which it casts them is that which pleases the predominant power in the government, whether this be a monarch, a priesthood, an aristocracy, or a majority of the existing generation, in proportion as it is efficient and successful, it establishes a despotism over the mind, leading by natural tendency to one over the body. And that's bad. Right? And we all know that's bad, and we all know that Mill is right. And so we can all see this very simple thing that we need to do. Remember, it was back in 1955 that Milton Friedman suggested school vouchers. And by the way, 1955 is strange because it's a long time ago, but I wasn't born that long after that, which is a weird combination. My father used to have this cartoon on his office door at the University of Toronto, and in case it's too is illegible, the guy is saying, of course, that was long ago, but at the time it seemed like the present. And so Milton Friedman made the suggestion, and it seemed like the present, and suddenly it's 70 years in the past, and nothing has been done for the most part. What the heck? This is a very strange thing, and I'll come back to this business about the passage of time. And like Kamala Harris, if you think about it, there is great significance to the passage of time. What? Anyway, but there is. So there are other things we could talk about that we need to do, but that was my preliminary list of just low-hanging fruit. As some of you know, I did a documentary on fixing Canada's Constitution back in 2016. And there was an immediate, enduring groundswell of lack of interest in the whole thing. I'm impressed by how many people simultaneously didn't care. But those of you who are thinking about constitutional reform, please do look it up on my website, because it is free, and it is a consistent, complete, coherent program based on tradition, not on my suddenly having reinvented political economy. That book review that says there's much that is good and original in this book, but what is good is not original, and what is original is not good. So beware of people who've reinvented a field of knowledge entirely. I'm not one of those, luckily. So that's what we need to do, but then you get this question, who are we waiting for? And I think this is an important part of getting ourselves galvanized, is to ask in particular, are we waiting for the politicians? Because I don't think they're even on the bus. And we've brought this up before, but I'm going to bring it up again. And when I insult people, I assume I'm not talking about you. But there are a large number of people that you know who give money to political parties. Year after year, they scrape together what they can spare, and they send it to political parties. The amount of money that the Conservative Party in this country raises every year dwarfs the amount of money that the think tanks and all the kinds of networks that are building a genuinely conservative infrastructure ever manage to get. And yet, what do the politicians ever give you except disappointment? And it's very strange. You know that thing, if you build it, they will come, right? If you keep paying politicians to cheat you of your hopes and aspirations, I assure you they'll keep doing it. And we always make this pitch, and I'll make it again. There's a lot of people in this room with the hat out, and I am one of them. If you think what we are doing is important, please find $2 a month for each of us. I was one time, shortly before he took down the numbers on his fundraising, when Jordan Peterson was rising to international fame because he wouldn't back down and he kept telling the truth, and he'd set up this crowdfunding thing, and he was getting something like $50,000 a month, which is like, what they say, rich or poor, it's nice to have money. But then I looked and I realized that was from over 8,000 people. So the average contribution was under $7. Let's make sure we do that. And for some of these groups, I'll give you $5, you give me $5. Neither of us is really better off, but it looks better. And it's just part of building momentum. But please do understand that if you give money to political parties, not to the people who are moving the goalposts, then you're going to get what you've always got. And as Dr. Phil says, how's that working for you? We're the people trying to build an infrastructure of liberty. And I know that there's a potential tension between liberty and tradition, but I am of the view that it is far more imaginary than real. Because, again, I was reading Gilbert magazine, and these are the kind of things Chesterton tossed off, one after another, with this astonishing brilliance. If our government were really a representative government, it would certainly not be a meddlesome government. And this is part of what we're trying to get back to. A government that, like Robert Peel said about the police, really is an extension of the people, doing professionally what the people would do because it is what they want. The police are only meant to be the professionals enforcing the same standards and giving the same protections as we would all do. And when we start to do things like get photo radar tickets for going 62 in a 50 zone, and I picked that example at random, I feel that this compact has been violated. And there's so many ways. When I get a call from the city officials, they show up to threaten me that they are going to bulldoze my front yard and fine me for it because I have allowed a meadow to appear, nurturing the butterflies and the bees and the pollinators. I feel that this is not really my government. It's this strange group of people in tactical vests with 6 weapons dangling from their belt who have somehow taken over. And again, we have governments that are infinitely meddlesome and don't seem to feel that in doing so they're violating the spirit of traditional Anglosphere liberty, but they are. And to come back to politicians, if you manage to talk to politicians, and again, some of you are in that kind of network, and you get to talk to conservative politicians about your concerns, and they are very good at sounding as though at some point, in the fullness of time, as circumstances permit, and with due prudence, they will certainly do whatever thing you just said that they secretly agree with. But as you know, after you leave the office, they tell their aide, never let that person in again, and it never happens, no matter how simple and obvious it is. Think of the hopes that were invested, the time, the effort, and the money in making Jason Kenney Premier of Alberta. And what did you get for it? Or Doug Ford in Ontario, or Stephen Harper as Prime Minister of Canada. Once in a generation, the federal Tories win power, and what do they do with it? $50 billion deficits, collapse in defense spending, radical social programs, and they don't repeal the Canada Health Act. Even though Stephen Harper was a libertarian, remember the big knock on him? He's this brain in a jar who didn't believe in government. Well, when he got into office, he sure believed in government. And some of you may remember when he was head of the National Citizens Coalition, he was a vehement opponent of election campaign finance gag laws. But when he got into office, suddenly he thought that shutting up people who were criticizing him was just a fine old thing to do. So governments do this to you, politicians do this to you again and again. So don't wait for the politicians, please. I realize, again, in this room, that's not a reflex. But it's not going to happen until we make it happen. And again, as I may have mentioned, I was reading Gilbert magazine. Look, it even got into my slideshow. And I really do recommend that you subscribe to it. It's the magazine of the Society of G.K. Chesterton. And how one guy could have a society that publishes a magazine for 25 years full of original material, that is a tribute to the genius of G.K. Chesterton and the determination of Dale Ahlquist. So there was this piece by David Beresford, and he was writing about Atlas Shrugged, and how he really disliked Ayn Rand's novel because it seemed to him to glorify all that was worst in human beings. And he said that the people that he knows, whether they're rich and successful or poor and humble, are on the whole nice and generous with their time and their efforts. But then he said, you know, in one sense he was wrong. The book was prophetic, not because Atlas shrugged, but because the world sitting on Atlas's shoulders decided to jump off. 2 years ago in Canada, every institution in Canadian society rejected the help of their many dedicated volunteers and outlawed public participation in clubs, amateur sports, education, and religious observance. Any gathering of 5 or more were prohibited, even in our homes. Christmas and Easter were canceled. Sunday Mass was canceled. Religious services were outlawed, whereas liquor stores, pot shops, big box stores, and professional sports were all kept open. The lines of demarcation were obvious. If it freely benefited families, helped the elderly, or made life better for people, it was canceled. Youth curling, gone. House league hockey, gone. Public arenas, locked. Public pools, public parks, public walking trails, shut down. Access blocked with padlocks and chains, patrolled by the police. People, including children, were fined, sometimes pushed violently to the ground and then arrested. Funerals, weddings, baptisms, first communions, these were outlawed. All of our social, religious, and media institutions collaborated. A few Christian congregations resisted, and their pastors were arrested, sometimes just for reading the Bible outdoors. The City of Toronto, among others, opened up snitch lines so people could report anyone who celebrated Christmas or Easter. And where were these politicians who've been telling you for 25 years that they believe in freedom? Where were any of them? Not just some of them. Where was the politician who walked out of a conservative caucus because of these restrictions? And then, Beresford adds, Spontaneously, without any central organization, House League hockey was restarted by invitation only, on frozen ponds and rinks behind barns and hedges, away from the searching eyes of both officialdom and vindictive neighbors. At our home, we raised the height of the fence so people could not see into our yard from the road, which allowed us to host euchre tournaments and Christmas feasts, live music events with visitors parking behind a large wood pile away from view. Everywhere, priests said Mass in private homes with time and place communicated by word of mouth to those who could be trusted to keep quiet. Yeah, good on them, but how could this happen in Canada in the 21st century? Why were people obliged to hide the fact that they were celebrating Mass, and where were the politicians? What is wrong with these people? Many of whom, when they were young, really did believe in freedom. But the more they wormed their way into the system and the more they slithered up the greasy pole, the more they treated principles as for chumps. Well, don't wait for them. And it didn't matter what partisan stripe the government was. You got this stuff because those politicians who claimed to be conservative were kidding themselves, you or both. And you know, as Ralph Klein famously said, you know, show me a big enough parade and I'll get in front of it. So we've got to create this parade that says that that's the real Canada, not those masks. And I recently wrote a column heckling the mayor of Calgary for her handling of the water. And I mentioned, because I screen captured it in case you took it down once I said it, that on her official bio on the webpage, she's wearing a mask. In 2024? Like, you liked that stuff, didn't you? I mean, and again, she didn't ever say she was conservative. There is a line I occasionally quote from Tony Robbins, and I think I've mentioned to you, I'm not big on these success gurus, but Tony Robbins is tall. And I've always wanted to be tall, so I think, okay, perhaps with his methods. But he did say, nobody ever said on their deathbed, I wish I'd watched more television. And this led me to kind of make a list of things people don't say on their deathbed that they wish they'd spent more time doing. And the funny thing, of course, is that a lot of the things you'd put on that list are things that you're going to go and do tonight, or at least I probably am. But one of them that I thought of while I was getting ready for this conference, I wish I'd spent more time compromising my principles. So many people, and this includes people in politics, when they're out of it again, they'll say, you know what, if I had it to do over again, I'd speak up. And it's like, well, great, thank you. The courage of the ex-politician brings a tear to my eye. And I remember, like, not to reveal to you horrifyingly what a petty person I am and the grudges I hold, but I was a Reform Party researcher a long time ago. And I went to Ottawa to work for them and got stuck. It's why I'm still behind enemy lines. But over and over again, I would have these arguments with everybody from my immediate boss all the way up to Preston Manning, telling them, we need to stick to our principles. We need to be bold. We need to get out there with controversial proposals that we've thought through, and we need to stand up for them. And I was told, oh, John, you don't understand how the real world works. We are going to compromise our way into power, and then we'll really change this country. And, you know, of the people that I had those arguments with, I'm still in Ottawa, and they're not. And there's a reason why that is true. And on a somewhat less sour vein, I was recently talking to somebody, a couple of years ago, which is now recently, like actually, to me now, like a quarter century ago is recently. But I was talking to somebody that I've known loosely in the public policy world for decades. And he commented to me that he was depressed by how many really good ideas he'd been involved in putting forward over the years, and how few of them had ever gotten adopted by governments. And in fact, he said to me, you know, I've always thought that you were a little too raw, you're a little too rough-edged and a little too blunt. But he said, you know, maybe, in fact, now that I've seen what happened, it would have been a good idea if I'd been a bit more that way too. And I was like, well, gosh, modesty forbids me to take a bow, but it's important to realize that what this guy was talking about were ideas that really were good ideas, carefully thought through, researched, presented with clarity, and yet they bounced off governments. And again, it didn't matter what the partisan stripe was. If the government was already going to do it, they would say, and this has been recommended by so-and-so. But if they weren't going to do it, there was, who's that guy? And by the way, there is a whole branch of economics devoted to why governments don't do smart stuff. And it's called public choice theory, so that nobody will ever go anywhere near it. This is a name that not even a PR expert could love. But, you know, the bottom line is that politicians and bureaucrats respond to incentives, like all human beings. And in government, the incentives are often very badly wrong. And when incentives are bad, people do bad stuff. And you sometimes think, why are they so dumb? And then you realize, no, it's not that they're dumb. It's us, because we allowed these incentives to exist. And one of these is letting governments get away with policies we know are terrible year after year, continuing to vote for them, buying the lesser evil argument. You know, people tell me, we've got to vote for the lesser of the two evils in the election. It's like, no, I don't. You know, I will not vote for certain candidates to keep Satan out of the White House. And if the only candidates running are Satan and this other person I won't vote for, that's not my fault. I remember one time someone framed it as, which of these two villains from Game of Thrones would you vote for? And luckily, I had no idea who either of them were, but I said I wouldn't. I'd write a cast and vote for Gandalf. Right? You can always make a change if you can believe that the change can happen. And of course, it's a messy business. Again, I think I'm going to quote G.K. Chesterton from Gilbert Magazine here to break the pattern. He said, democracy as a failure is better than dictatorship as a success. So having said all of that, and without wishing to take any more of your time as the winged chariot thunders toward us, it's funny that as I was thinking about what to say and how to wrap up the conference and inspire everybody, I kept thinking to myself, what exactly are we waiting for? And, you know, there are several reasons why you don't want to hang around waiting for yourself to do good things. And one of them, of course, is that I'm not nearly as young as I was when I was a lot younger than I am now. So partly it's personal, I guess. But it's also because you strike when the iron is hot. Including in politics. There's a maxim in politics that an incoming administration has about 6 months to do big things. And by the time, if 6 months has gone by, the bureaucratic opposition will have organized, people will have settled in, they'll have stopped believing in whatever it is they came for. As somebody said about people in, I think the George Bush Senior administration, they didn't have ideals, they had mortgages. And so the other day I was having this debate with somebody who shall remain nameless on Twitter, speaking of things you don't get to your deathbed and wish you'd spent more time doing, who was saying, oh, you know, Oliver should not commit to radical things. He should avoid upsetting people. He should get himself elected and then he can figure out what to do. And I thought to myself, partly he's been in politics for 20 years. If he hasn't figured out what to do, he's not about to suddenly. But in the second place, if he does get elected, he needs to start changing things fast. And if they all get in there and say, what did we come here for again? I don't remember. Let's have an interdepartmental committee struck on tax reform. Like, ugh. Or again, I'm going to mention Danielle Smith. Right? Like, what is she doing? Danielle is or was a libertarian. She gets to be premier of this province, which is a pretty freedom-oriented province. Why aren't rules and regulations falling into the bin one after another? Why is she not making this province freer? Why is she not acting boldly? What is she waiting for? It's incredible to me that this should happen. And the other thing, of course, is about when you're trying to make your life make some kind of sense. You get up in the morning and you try and do the most important things on your list, which in my case is like, must wake up. And so an hour and a half into the day, I'm like, okay, what's next? Must make coffee. But you think about the things that you need to do. And of course, there's family and there's jobs, and they do come first and second. But then there's change the way this place is governed so it doesn't horrify me so much that I will go and listen to John Robson speak twice in 2 days. There must be some better alternative. So we know what needs to do, and we need to do it, so let's get at it. And when I say that, I don't mean, be unrealistic. I don't mean be petulant. But I mean, if we know what needs to be done, and we're going to get it done, and you start talking to some politician, candidate or incumbent, and they start doing the dance of the seven vagues about practicalities, tell them, no, I want a commitment. And if I get out of here without a commitment, I'm going to tell people that I asked you to do this and you said no. Including on school vouchers, if it's provincial particularly. Say, are you going to bring in school vouchers? And if you're not, tell me why not, and I will happily share it with all the people who will be duly horrified. Or with the people who are running for federal office. And again, it's great having Maxime here because I know that I'm not insulting him when I say this stuff. But with Pierre Poilievre, will you repeal the Canada Health Act? Yes or no? I may have mentioned at times, I was on the Ottawa Citizen editorial board for 6 years, and one of the athlete's foot-style blights of that job was that people kept asking for meetings with the ed board, particularly politicians, and my boss kept saying yes. And I would say, why do you let these blatherskites in? But he always did. And then they would come in, so I would ask them some question that seemed to me to get to the heart of the matter and wait for a yes or a no, and I always got a well. Never, I'm not kidding, in 6 years, never did I get a yes or a no. I always got wells. It's like, is that what you went into public life for, to equivocate from the opening mumble? Good heavens. Terrible. So I want to know what they're waiting for. But again, I quoted this yesterday, I'll quote it again. Reality cannot be ignored except at a price. And the longer the ignorance is persisted in, the higher and the more terrible becomes the price that must be paid. Colonel Redmond said it's not too late, but it is late. And this is another thing we have to take into account. Or as Michael Binion said this morning, it's going to take us 2 decades to get out of the hole we've dug for ourselves. That's a long time to suffer for 9 years of inattention to public policy. And by the way, a line from Winston Churchill when he finally became prime minister and his police detective, like his personal protection guy, congratulated him, and Churchill, with tears in his eyes, says, "I hope that it is not too late. I am very much afraid that it is. We can only do our best." Well, it's not as late now as it was in Britain at the fall of France, so that actually is encouraging. But in order to get all this done, and I'll be talking about this again tomorrow, so if I say it now, you won't have to come, which is bad because we want you to. Never tell a lie and never acquiesce in a lie. I think this is just so important, and it's apparently radical. But what the heck? Let's try and see what happens. Because one of the problems in politics, and I get this all the time, people are backing one candidate against someone they think is terrible. And they're right, other person's terrible. But then they start denying that their own candidate is terrible, or pretending they don't have certain flaws. And it's like, you've been corrupted by politics. You are telling me things about a candidate that no sane person could think, and that I don't think you think. You cannot seriously, and again, I could lose all my friends in this room by saying just because Joe Biden cannot possibly function as president doesn't mean Donald Trump is a good choice. They could, in principle, both be awful. And if they were, people should say it. And yet there's people, oh, Biden's great, he's fine, he's sharp as a tack, and Trump, he's like marvelous. It's like, no. Tell the truth. If Trump was a Democrat, you'd hate him. And if Biden was a Republican, the Democrats would say he was non-compos mentis. Never tell a lie. We have this on good authority. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Then, and again, this is not something to be done only when convenient or safe. That is not how it works. And of course, part of the thing about telling the truth, again, I think I'll quote Chesterton from Gilbert, a society is in decay, final or transitional, when common sense has really become very uncommon. Straightforward ideas appear strange and unfamiliar, and any thought that does not follow the conventional curve or twist is supposed to be a sort of joke. And a lot of the things that we would like to do will be treated as jokes by the political establishment, not even as threats or outrages, but as ridiculous. Well, fine. We will see who gets the last laugh if we persist. If we say, no, it is actually the conventional wisdom that is so weird. Like, again, that the Canada Health Act is working. Who could possibly observe the situation and think that? And this is also from Gilbert Magazine. It's just one issue, okay? I'm sorry, it happened to me. I read it on the way here, and I couldn't stop myself. That Father Ian Boyd, just passed away, commented that Chesterton never writes about religion so much as when he is writing about something else, because for Chesterton, church wasn't just on Sundays. And I know that you're not all Christian. I don't think you're all Christian. Maybe you're all Christian. But here's what Chesterton said about it. It's from Gilbert Magazine. Philosophy is not expressed when people are talking about philosophy, but when they are talking about anything else. So if we have principles, if we really have principles, we believe in our principles, we live our principles, they infuse our politics. And if one of our principles is never tell a lie, never acquiesce in a lie, then we do not put up with the deceits of politicians, even in private conversations with them. We say to them, that is not an honest or an honorable statement, and if you do not correct it and live up to what you say, I will no longer support you financially, or in the ballot box, or in conversations with other people. And we don't put up with nonsense just because it's typical of the elites. Again, this is Chesterton from Gilbert Magazine. The man who says there are no sexes or no nations fares simply and precisely like the man who says there are no chairs and tables. He falls over them. Right? We know these things to be true, as we know that people who ignore the rules of economics or neglect national security or scoff at faith and honor bring ruin upon themselves and their societies. So don't wait for social acceptability. This is Chesterton from Gilbert Magazine. Talking about serious questions is a pleasure. It is perhaps the greatest mere pleasure known to man. Even devils, as Milton truly perceived, would discuss theology. Theology is a pleasure, but in our time it is a secret pleasure. It is enjoyed in dark corners like a vice. And by the way, one of the reasons I became a huge Chesterton fan is that he was saying stuff like this more than 100 years ago. That he had discerned the direction in which modernity was going with an amazing, compelling prophetic clarity. And when someone's predictions are that good, you got to figure that they understand things better. Chesterton helped bring me to Christ, because I thought to myself, if this man is a Christian, I'm missing something about that religion. But, I mean, and you know what Paul said about whenever he wants to talk politics, his family's like, oh, Dad. And yeah, there's people who aren't going to want to hear it from you. And don't be a pest. Don't be obnoxious. But if you are talking about public affairs, talk about them seriously and find joy in doing so. Say, we are fixing a big problem. We are making a better country. And this is a great, exciting adventure to be engaged in. Now, I do always also have to remind people here, please, to do this in such a way that you persuade people, that you are an example, that the light shines through you, not the darkness. Again, we get this from a pretty authoritative source. As Peter says, be ready always to give an answer to every man who asketh you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. Meekness meaning mild-manneredness, not mousiness. This is the King James. And anybody who doesn't like the King James on theological grounds, I'm just going to say it's the greatest prose ever written, and I'm, for now, sticking with it. So, you know, do it in a way that brings them into the adventure. Don't do it in a way that drives them away. And beware, and there are people in this room, and I will not name any of them, but there are some, not that which goeth into the mouth defileth a man, but that which cometh out of the mouth, this defileth a man. Do not give in to the darkness. Do not become obnoxious. Please don't swear. Don't insult people in idiotic ways. Don't fall into the dark habits. I know. I myself, by the way, on this, I don't know what I'm supposed to call it. Twitter was fine by me. X, right? So if you post something, do you X it out? But anyway, I will not repost things with cuss words in them. And often there's a really good post, but the person just got potty mouth in the middle of it. And I'm like, why do that? I was just having an argument. I'd said that everything Trudeau touched turned to lead. And somebody said, you should have used the word we were all thinking. And I proceeded to quote my favorite political insult of all time, which comes from Benjamin Disraeli about Lord John Russell. He said, if a traveler were informed that this man were leader of the House of Commons, he might begin to understand how the Egyptians worshipped an insect. Now that's an insult, right? Beep you is not. It defiles everybody. So yes, the truth will offend people. We were warned of that today, and it's true. But don't use the truth as an excuse to offend people. Offend them if you must, but only because they're not willing to hear the truth, not because you clobbered them with it, instead of inviting them in with it. And again, coincidences are sometimes not coincidences. There's somebody who sends me a lot of material via email, including quotations as well as humor. And this morning, oh, sorry, it's not that one. This is just about controlling yourself. Angry people want you to see how powerful they are. Loving people want you to see how powerful you are. We want to inspire other people to believe that together we can improve this country. And we have to be careful about our tone for their sakes and for our own. So please really do believe that. Yeah, and then that was where this thing, which was on a t-shirt at a dojo. So that's why from the sublime to the sweaty. But you know what? Wisdom is wisdom wherever you find it. And so do exercise some discipline. And then Tanya mentioned that passage from Jeremiah about girding your loins. And if you've ever wondered what girding your loins is about, right? Like, how did loins get in here, and why would I gird them? I finally found out the answer to that. The Israelites tended on the whole to wear toga-like robes with a belt or girdle, right? And then if you were about to go into combat, you don't want to trip over this thing because it's down to your knees to keep you reasonably cool in the desert. So you'd pull it between your legs, get it up tight behind, stuff it into the belt, and then your legs were free for action. So this is what girding your loins is about. And if nothing else I say is useful, perhaps you'll remember that and bore people with it somewhere at some time. But yeah, we want to gird our loins, and we want to do it saying we know what needs to be done. We're not waiting for anybody else, and we're not waiting for ourselves either. We're going to do this thing. And again, this is Chesterton from Gilbert Magazine. He said, against such this aching vacuum of joyless approval, that's the kind of progressive vision of progress toward a state that doesn't resemble happiness. There's only one antidote, a sudden and pugnacious belief in positive evil. This world can be made beautiful again by beholding it as a battlefield. When we have defined and isolated the evil thing, the colors come back into everything. When all evil things have become evil, good things in a blazing apocalypse become good. There are some men who are dreary because they do not believe in God, but there are many others who are dreary because they do not believe in the devil. The grass grows green again when we believe in the devil. The true optimist can only continue as an optimist as long as he's discontented. For the full value of this life can only be got by fighting. The violent take it by storm. And if we have accepted everything, we've missed something, war. This life of ours is a very enjoyable fight, but a very miserable truce. So let us embark on that enjoyable fight. Thank you.